March 1943, a German supply. March 1943, a German supply ship leaves a heavily guarded French harbour. It's been inspected, swept for mines, cleared by every detection system the Nazis have. 48 hours later, it's at the bottom of the channel. No explosion in the harbour, no wreckage, no cause of death. Officially, unknown. But here's what the Germans never found. The weapon wasn't a mine. It wasn't a torpedo. It was a stone, a pebble, pressed to the hull by a single frogman. And it looked like nothing at all. That's why it worked. That's the story of the weapon the Nazis couldn't see, even when they were staring right at it. The British Pebble Bomb that sank ships without leaving a trace. It is the 14th of March, 1943, and the harbour at Boulogne is quiet in the way that occupied places are always quiet, with a stillness that feels imposed rather than earned. The water is dark, glassy and cold. German sentries pace the quayside, their breath fogging in the night air, their eyes scanning the dock for threats they can see. For threats they can see. A Royal Navy frogman slides beneath the surface and moves towards the belly of a 4,000-ton supply vessel. He carries no limpet mine, no time-fused charge, no explosive device of any recognizable form. What he carries looks, to all appearances, like a small, unremarkable stone. He presses it to the hull. He swims away. Over the next 48 hours, nothing happens. The ship is inspected. The harbour is swept. German main detection equipment, among the most sophisticated in the occupied world, finds nothing. The vessel departs for its scheduled run along the French coast, heavy with fuel and ammunition intended for Rommel's retreating Africa cause. Somewhere in the channel, a muffled thump reverberates through the water. The ship lists. Within hours, it slips beneath the surface. The cause is listed, officially, as unknown. The small, unremarkable stone has done its job. What the Germans could not find, what their instruments could not detect, what their divers could not see, was a device so subtle in its design and so radical in its concept that it would take Allied intelligence teams weeks to even confirm its existence. It did not contain the conventional explosives that mine detectors were calibrated to find. It did not emit the magnetic signature that triggered the standard countermeasures. It resembled nothing in any enemy weapons catalogue. It was, in every meaningful sense, invisible. This is the story of the Pebble Bomb, or, as the Special Operations Executive logged it under heavy classification, the Clam, and the small, underfunded, perpetually overlooked Department of British Ingenuity that built it. It is a story about what happens when the most powerful navy on Earth finds itself outgunned, outnumbered, and forced to fight dirty. It is a story about the science of making a weapon disappear. And it begins not in 1943, but in the desperate winter of 1940. When Britain stood alone and the English Channel was the only thing standing between Adolf Hitler and total European domination. To understand why the Pebble Bomb existed at all, you have to understand the problem it was designed to solve, and that problem was enormous. By the end of 1940, Germany controlled the entire coastline of Western Europe, from the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border. Every major Atlantic port, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Bordeaux, was now a German naval facility. Every harbour on the Channel coast was bristling with resupply vessels, patrol boats, and the infrastructure of a continent-spanning occupation. The German war machine needed those supply lines. Without them, the garrisons in France would starve, the U-boat pens would run dry, and the entire Western apparatus of the Nazi Empire would begin to seize up. The Royal Navy knew this. Targeting those supply vessels was not merely desirable, it was strategically essential. But the methods available in 1940 were, to put it bluntly, inadequate. Conventional bombing raids on harbours were expensive, imprecise, and lethal to British air crews. In 1940 and 1941, Bomber Command was losing aircraft at a rate that Whitehall found quietly terrifying. A raid on a single harbour might require a dozen aircraft, cost 3 or 4 crews, and destroy no more than 1 or 2 vessels. If the weather cooperated, if the anti-aircraft batteries were suppressed, if the bombs found their targets at all, the mathematics were appalling. Naval bombardment was worse still. To bring a destroyer or cruiser within range of a defended French harbour was to invite catastrophe. The Germans had reinforced the Atlantic coastline with coastal artillery that could engage targets at ranges exceeding 20 kilometres. Submarines could mine harbour approaches, but the time required to lay a covert minefield, the risk of detection, and the indiscriminate nature of naval mines made them a blunt instrument in a situation that demanded precision. And then there were the conventional limpet mines, the standard sabotage device of the war. A limpet mine was, in essence, a magnetic charge that clung to a ship's steel hull and detonated on a timer. British special forces and resistance networks had been using them with some success since 1941. But the Germans were not ignorant. By mid-1942, German naval security had adapted. Harbour patrols were intensified. Acoustic detection equipment was deployed beneath the water in key anchorages. And most critically, German technicians developed degaussing systems, electrical coils that reduced a vessel's magnetic signature, specifically designed to defeat the limpet mine's magnetic attachment mechanism. Overnight, the most reliable close-quarter ship-killing tool available to British saboteurs had been largely neutralized. A limpet mine pressed to a degaussed hull would simply fall off. Weeks of preparation, months of training, the lives of agents and frogmen, all rendered useless by a coil of copper wire and a sufficiently paranoid German engineering corps. Britain needed something else, something that stuck to a hull without magnetism, something that could not be swept, could not be detected, could not be identified, something, in the words of one SOE technical brief, that looks like nothing at all. The organisation that answered this challenge was Station 9, formerly the Inter-Services Research Bureau, based at the Frythe, a converted country house hotel near Welwyn in Hertfordshire. To the locals, it was an unremarkable requisitioned building. To the war effort, it was one of the most productive research facilities in the world. This was the home of the SOE's technical division, staffed by chemists, engineers, inventors, and a category of person that the British wartime establishment reluctantly tolerated: the brilliant eccentric. The man most directly responsible for the Clam's development was a civilian engineer attached to Station 9 whose background was in industrial adhesives and polymer chemistry. His name is not widely recorded in public documents. Station 9 maintained extraordinary operational security, but the thinking behind the device is attributable to his team. The challenge they faced was deceptively simple to state and ferociously difficult to solve. How do you attach an explosive charge to the hull of a ship without using magnetism, without leaving visible evidence, and without relying on mechanical fixings that a diver or inspector might find? The answer they arrived at was audacious in its simplicity. They would use plastic explosive, specifically Nobel's explosive number 808, a British formulated compound of cyclonite and mineral oil that was plastic at room temperature, meaning it could be shaped by hand, like clay. Nobel 808 had been in limited use since the late 1930s and was familiar to SOE demolitions experts. It detonated only when subjected to a sharp shockwave from a detonator. Not by heat, not by impact, not by compression. This made it extraordinarily safe to carry, and extraordinarily difficult for enemy equipment to identify as a threat. But plastic explosive alone did not solve the attachment problem. The Clam's genius was in what surrounded the explosive core. The weapon was encased in a shell of molded resin and powdered stone. Actual ground limestone, selected for its density, its color, and its extraordinary visual similarity to the kind of sea-smoothed pebbles found on any British or French beach. The finished device was roughly 135 millimeters long, 65 millimeters wide, and weighed approximately 450 grams. It contained roughly 200 grams of Nobel 808. The attachment mechanism was neither magnetic nor mechanical. The inner face of the Clam, the face that pressed against the hull, was coated with a specially formulated industrial adhesive derived from synthetic rubber compounds. This adhesive would bond to a painted steel surface with a grip of approximately 22 kilograms per square centimeter, sufficient to hold the device in place against water currents, against the vibration of the ship's engines, and against the pressure waves of nearby depth charges. It would not respond to magnetic sweep equipment. It had no metal components of any kind. It produced no acoustic signature. A trained diver running his hands along a ship's hull would feel nothing unusual. The device's curved outer profile sat flush against the steel, its surface texture indistinguishable in poor visibility from the barnacle growth and fouling found on any vessel that spent time in harbour. The detonation mechanism was a standard time pencil, a chemical timer that SOE used across dozens of devices. The saboteur would crush a small glass capsule within the pencil, releasing acid that would slowly eat through a wire retaining a striker. Depending on the ambient water temperature, the timer could be calibrated for periods ranging from 30 minutes to 48 hours. A frogman operating in a cold February harbour where the water temperature might be 6 or 7 degrees Celsius would find their timer running slower than expected. In warmer Mediterranean conditions, the same pencil might fire significantly faster. Operators were trained to account for this. Multiple pencils could be fitted to a single device for redundancy. Production of the Clam is believed to have begun in earnest in early 1942. Exact manufacturing numbers remain classified or have never been released, but estimates drawn from SOE supply records suggest that several thousand were produced before the end of the war. They were manufactured in small batches to maintain quality control over the adhesive compound, which was sensitive to temperature during application. Documenting the Clam's operational history is complicated by the fact that successful sabotage operations were, by definition, designed to leave no traceable evidence. When a ship sank in an occupied harbour and no debris was recovered, no one filed a report crediting a specific device. The Germans recorded many such losses as accidents, mechanical failures, or unknown causes, precisely the outcome British planners intended. What records do survive from SOE operational logs point to use in the French Atlantic ports, in the harbours of occupied Norway, and in the Adriatic, where small British special operations teams worked alongside partisan networks to disrupt Axis coastal supply routes. A series of unexplained losses in the harbour at Split in 1943 has been tentatively attributed to Clam deployments by British-trained Croatian partisans. Operations in Norway, particularly targeting the coastal traffic that supplied German garrisons and the heavy water facilities at Vemork, are documented in fragments, enough to confirm use, not enough to construct a complete operational record. The Frankton Raid of December 1942, perhaps the most celebrated British special operations mission of the war, used limpet mines, not clams, against vessels in the Gironde estuary. But the broader programme of harbour sabotage, of which Frankton was a part, relied heavily on the Clam's ability to operate in harbours where conventional limpet mines had been rendered ineffective by degaussing. The two devices were complementary tools, not competing ones. If you are finding this interesting, a subscribe helps us keep making these. It genuinely means more than you might think. To understand what made the Clam remarkable, it helps to place it alongside its contemporaries. The German equivalent, the Haftholladung, or magnetic hollow charge, was a powerful device designed for attacking armor plate and hull structures. It attached via three powerful permanent magnets and was effective against undegaussed targets. Against degaussed hulls, it was useless. The Germans never solved this problem during the war. Their approach to harbour security was systemic. Better patrols, more sensors, more divers. Rather than technological, they assumed that the threat would always carry metal. The American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, worked in close collaboration with SOE and had access to Clam designs by late 1942. American agents deployed Clams in operations across the Pacific Theatre and in occupied Europe, though American documents typically refer to the device generically or by SOE nomenclature. The OSS did develop its own variant, a slightly enlarged version using American-sourced explosive. But the fundamental architecture remained British. The adhesive concept, the stone powder camouflage, the flush profile hull attachment. These were Station 9 innovations. No other Allied power produced a device of comparable sophistication in this category. Soviet special operations favored heavier demolitions, charges deployed through direct action rather than covert infiltration. Free French saboteurs frequently received British supplies, including clams. The Poles, perhaps the most skilled and motivated resistance fighters in occupied Europe, used SOE-supplied devices extensively in the sabotage of German transport infrastructure. Though their theatre of operations was primarily railways and industrial facilities rather than shipping. What set the Clam apart was not explosive power. 200 grams of plastic explosive was a modest charge, sufficient to breach a hull plate and flood a compartment, but not to immediately destroy a large vessel. The point was not instantaneous destruction. The point was controlled, delayed, unattributable damage at a moment of maximum operational inconvenience. A supply ship that sank in deep water en route to Rommel's lines was worth infinitely more to Britain than a supply ship that was evacuated and repaired in harbour. Assessing the true impact of the Clam on the Allied war effort requires a degree of intellectual honesty about what we do and do not know. The SOE, by design, destroyed the majority of its operational records before the end of the war. What survived was often the administrative detritus, supply orders, training manuals, technical specifications, rather than mission reports. What we can say with confidence is this: the device worked. Harbours that had been hardened against conventional limpet mines were not hardened against the Clam, and the Germans appear never to have definitively identified the device as the cause of their unexplained harbour losses. Post-war German naval intelligence assessments, declassified in the 1970s, attributed multiple wartime vessel losses to unknown causes in circumstances that are consistent with Clam deployment. Whether those losses changed the strategic balance of the war is a question historians continue to debate. The psychological dimension is harder to quantify, but arguably more significant. German harbour security became progressively more paranoid and resource-intensive as the war continued. The fear of undetectable sabotage, sabotage that looked like nothing, that left no trace, that could be anywhere, forced the Germans to deploy thousands of man-hours in security operations that might otherwise have served operational purposes. Every ship that had to be inspected twice, every anchorage that required underwater patrols, every sentry who stood longer hours because the threat could not be identified. These were costs imposed not by a single spectacular explosion, but by the persistent, maddening possibility that the threat might be a pebble. The Clam influenced post-war British thinking on covert maritime demolitions. Its adhesive attachment principle was incorporated into Royal Navy Special Operations doctrine, and variants of the concept appeared in devices developed well into the Cold War period. The idea that a weapon should be unrecognizable as a weapon, that the best camouflage is radical ordinariness, became a lasting principle of British Special Operations development. A small number of surviving Clam devices can be examined at the Imperial War Museum in London and at Bletchley Park's associated collection. They sit in their display cases, looking exactly as they were designed to look. Unremarkable, inconsequential, utterly forgettable. Which was, of course, the point. Return, for a moment, to that harbour at Boulogne in March 1943. Return to the dark water, the fogged breath of the sentries, the routine inspection that found nothing because there was nothing recognizable to find. The frogman has long since disappeared. The device is already working. The acid has already begun to eat the wire in the time pencil, silent and invisible in the cold dark beneath the hull. The ship will pass inspection. It will leave harbour. It will sail into the channel, carrying its cargo for a war effort, already beginning to fracture at the edges. The sentries at Boulogne were looking for mines. They had instruments tuned to find mines. They had trained divers who knew what mines looked like. And so, in the most essential sense, they were looking in exactly the wrong direction. A weapon that looked like nothing at all defeated a security apparatus looking for something. That was not an accident of design. That was the design. Station 9 built dozens of devices, exploding rats, turd-shaped charges for railway sabotage, sleeping pills disguised as sugar. The British wartime imagination for making dangerous things look harmless was, by any measure, extraordinary. But the Clam was perhaps its purest expression. Not because it was the most powerful, it was not. Not because it sank the most ships. The records make that impossible to claim with certainty, but because it was the most completely what it set out to be, a weapon invisible to everything except the hull it destroyed. The Germans swept their harbours for months. They improved their sensors. They increased their patrols. They tightened protocols and extended inspection procedures. And somewhere, in an occupied French anchorage, a small stone sat pressed against a hull, waiting for a wire to dissolve. You cannot secure a harbour against a threat that does not look like a threat. That is the lesson the Clam taught. It is a lesson that has never stopped being useful. Britain did not win the war with the Pebble Bomb, but it sent ships to the bottom that never should have sunk, in harbours that were supposed to be safe, by a method that was never officially confirmed. And in the quiet arithmetic of a long war, that is more than enough.